I never understood how quiet the world could become until the night the forest swallowed my voice. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 43 years old, and I've spent most of my life wandering the American West in an old Volkswagen converted RV that I've slowly rebuilt piece by piece. I thought I understood solitude. I thought I understood wilderness. But the Redwood forest of Northern California, those ancient giants towering like pillars of a forgotten temple, taught me that the silence of nature can be a warning just as much as a comfort. And in the summer of 2023, that silence nearly got me killed. I remember the drive-in, hours before sunset, mist crawling low through the trees, the air wet with that earthy sweetness the redwoods exhale after a long day of fog. I'd camped in California before, but something in these woods carried a different weight. The air felt older, thicker, like it held memory. I brushed it off as road weariness, the kind that creeps in after too many miles and too much caffeine. I had come here to reset, to be alone for a few nights and work through something I had been avoiding for years. The breakdown of my marriage, the house I had sold, the life I thought I was going to have. The RV wasn't just a vehicle. I had turned it into a temporary home, a confession booth on wheels where the road asked hard questions I wasn't ready to answer. I pulled into a quiet clearing just off a Forestry Service road, not an official campground, but a spot other RVers had told me about. The kind of place that doesn't appear on maps, but gets whispered between travelers like a secret. The redwoods rose like dark silhouettes around me, straight as columns, impossibly tall. I felt strangely protected by them, as if the forest itself was offering me a roof of branches and a floor of damp moss to rest on. I told myself this was the peace I needed. But peace has a way of deceiving you. Sometimes it's just the calm before your instincts wake up screaming. As evening crept in, the light filtered through the trees in those long, dusty beams that make everything look touched by gold. I made a small fire, contained, careful, and cooked a can of beans on my camp stove. The smell of the forest mixed with the smoke in a way that always reminds me of childhood summers with my father, long before he passed, long before life began to move faster than I could handle. I thought about him that night. I thought about whether he'd recognize the man I'd become, wandering the country alone. And somewhere between the crackle of the fire and the hum of the night insects, I realized I had been chasing solitude, not for clarity, but to hide from myself. The first sign something was wrong was the change in sound. It wasn't sudden. It happened like the world was slowly being muted. The insects quieted. Then the wind stopped rattling the branches. Even the distant rush of a nearby creek seemed to fade out. A forest that had sounded alive only minutes before now felt like it was holding its breath. I looked up from the fire, listening. Nothing. Just the sound of my own breath, too loud in the stillness. I tried to convince myself it was normal. Animals settle, temperatures drop, night changes things, but deep down, something ancestral stirred, some primal recognition that silence means danger. I dumped the last of the water on the fire, packed away the stove, and locked up the food. I climbed into the RV and slid into bed, trying to shake the feeling pressing against my ribs. I told myself I was being paranoid, that fear was just loneliness wearing a new face. But the unease clung to me, sitting heavy on my chest. Around midnight, I woke to a sound so faint I thought it was a dream. A low, rhythmic crunch of footsteps moving just outside the RV. Slow. Heavy, deliberate. My first thought was a deer, maybe an elk wandering through. But the weight of the footsteps felt wrong, predatory, measured, like something that understood how to stalk. The footsteps stopped. Silence hovered, dense and expectant. Then came the sniffing. Long, scraping breaths dragging across the bottom edge of the RV door. I froze. The sniff continued, moving from the door seam to the window. I didn't dare breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to turn on the lights, to make noise, to do something, but I stayed still. Animals attack what moves. Animals sense fear. I kept telling myself that, but another part of me whispered something else. Whatever is outside isn't acting like an animal curious about human food. It's acting like something curious about you. The sniffing paused again. I felt the RV shift slightly as if a weight had leaned against it. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, a low, guttural growl rolled through the air. Not a bear, not a cougar, a wolf. I hadn't realized wolves still lived in this part of California, at least not in packs, but that growl was unmistakable. A resonant primal sound that vibrated the thin metal walls of my RV and rattled something deep in my bones. I reached slowly for the flashlight by my bed, careful not to make noise. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Then another sound joined the first, lighter footsteps circling around the other side of the RV. And another. 3 sets, then a fourth. The crunch of their paws on dry leaves created a slow, circling rhythm like a sinister dance around my thin metal shelter. Wolves do not circle for curiosity. They circle for control. My breath caught in my throat as one of them let out a low, rising howl, a territorial call that echoed through the trees and seemed to vibrate through my ribcage. I could feel sweat gathering behind my neck despite the cold. Every part of my body screamed, stay still, stay quiet, but my mind was unraveling. I wasn't prepared for this. I had bear spray, yes, but that meant opening the door. And opening the door meant stepping into the center of a wolf circle. Minutes stretched into something like hours. The wolves paced, sniffed, bumped against the RV. At one point, something scratched lightly at the door, testing it. I could hear their claws clicking on the metal steps. One jumped against the side panel hard enough to make the cabinets rattle. Fear has stages, and somewhere during that endless midnight I crossed from dread into something more dangerous. Panic. I knew I had to do something, because doing nothing felt like waiting to be torn apart if the wolves got bold enough or hungry enough. I crawled to the driver's seat, moving like a man underwater, slow and stiff. I didn't turn on the lights. I knew better. Animals charge headlights, but I could feel them moving outside, hear the soft, soft sounds of their bodies brushing against the RV. I inserted the keys into the ignition with shaking hands. The click must have been louder than I thought. Instantly, 3 heavy thuds hit the side of the RV, claws scraping against the metal. The growling erupted into snarls so loud it felt like the air vibrated. Something bit at the door handle. Another slammed into the rear quarter panel. I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the wolves exploded into chaos outside, snarling, yelping, scattering in a frenzy of movement. I slammed the RV into reverse and hit the gas, feeling the wheels spin for a terrifying second on the damp earth before catching. The RV lurched backward, bouncing over roots and rocks, branches scraping across the sides like fingernails across a chalkboard. I didn't look back. I didn't breathe. I just drove. Down the forest road, the headlights caught glimpses of movement, shadows darting between trees, keeping pace, following. Wolves running parallel, silent and ghost-like. I gripped the wheel so tight my hands went numb. I didn't dare stop. I didn't dare slow down, and for 2 miles, 2 endless, harrowing miles, they ran beside me. They peeled away only when the road widened and the forest thinned, retreating into the darkness like ghosts dissolving into fog. I didn't stop until I reached a small ranger station near dawn. I parked under the dim security light and finally let the breath out of my lungs. My hands were shaking so violently I had to sit on them to make them stop. Later that morning, a ranger told me wolves had been sighted occasionally, but rarely in packs, rarely so close to human camps. He said I must have camped near a den without realizing it. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong night. But I knew better. Wolves aren't careless. That pack moved with intention. They watched me, studied me, tested the boundaries of the RV like they were searching for weakness. And if I had stepped outside, if I had hesitated a moment longer before starting the engine, I don't know if I'd still be here to tell this story. That night changed something in me. It stripped away the illusion that solitude is always peaceful. It forced me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. That running from my life had left me vulnerable, not just emotionally, but physically. I'd treated the forest like a sanctuary instead of a wild, living world that doesn't bend for human pain. I had come looking for silence, believing it would heal me. But silence in the wild can hide teeth. And yet, as terrifying as that night was, it taught me something I needed to hear. Survival isn't found in isolation. Strength isn't built by running from what scares you, whether it's wolves in the dark or the parts of your life you don't want to face. You learn to survive by acknowledging fear, respecting it, and refusing to let it decide your fate. I left the Redwood Forest a different man, not healed, not whole, but awake, and sometimes that's enough to start over, because the forest isn't cruel, it's honest. It doesn't care about your past, your heartbreak, your regrets. It only cares whether you can stand back up when the night presses in, whether you can look into the darkness, into the glowing eyes circling you and refuse to surrender. And if you can survive that, then there's nothing in the world, human or wild, that can break you. I've always believed that the quietest places reveal the loudest truths about who we really are, but nothing prepared me for the truth that found me on that cold Wyoming night. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 43 years old, a guy who spent half his life chasing open skies in an RV that rattles in the wind but somehow still feels like home. And in the summer of 2024, I took that home into Yellowstone National Park, thinking I understood wilderness. Not just its danger, but its rhythm, its rules, its warnings. I thought I knew how to read silence. I thought I knew what fear looked like. But the night a bear broke into my RV, I realized fear isn't something you see. It's something that learns the shape of you. I arrived at the campground just as the last light drained out of the sky, leaving the pines looking like dark, breathing pillars. Yellowstone has that way of swallowing up everything that isn't paying attention, and I guess I wasn't paying attention. I had driven 7 hours straight from Idaho Falls, chasing a break from everything that had been crowding my mind. My job, my divorce, the feeling that I'd somehow aged a decade in a single year. The campground seemed like the perfect reset. Families barbecuing, kids laughing by their RV steps, dogs barking at chipmunks. Nothing bad ever happens when the world looks that normal. That's what I told myself. I backed my old Volkswagen RV into my sight, shut off the engine, and let the sudden quiet sink into me. It felt peaceful, heavy, the kind of silence you mistake for safety. I should have noticed the signs. The ranger at the entrance giving me that long, searching look when I said I'd be camping alone. The 2 warning posters stapled to the wooden information board. Fresh bear activity reported near the west side of the campground. The claw marks on the metal dumpster near my site dented like something had tried to peel it open. But exhaustion makes you blind, and loneliness makes you reckless. I cooked a simple dinner, beans and rice, and ate it outside on a folding chair, watching the shadows stretch between the pines. The air smelled of pine sap and cold dirt, like every breath came from the center of the forest itself. Somewhere far off, a branch snapped. I barely reacted. Deer, I thought. Or a ranger. Maybe another camper cutting through the woods. But the sound didn't feel like something passing by. It felt like something watching. Eventually, the temperature dropped enough to push me back inside. I washed the dishes, locked the doors, checked the windows, and crawled into bed. The wind scraped across the roof, and every once in a while the RV rocked gently, like a boat on dark water. I've always loved that feeling, the vulnerability of being alone in a small space, knowing the world outside is massive and indifferent. It humbles you. But that night, for reasons I couldn't explain, it made my chest tight. I drifted off just before midnight. And maybe an hour later, the nightmare began. It started with a thud. Not loud, not violent, but deliberate. A slow, dense weight pressing against the side of the RV. I opened my eyes, not moving, listening. Another thud. Closer to the door this time, then a low, rhythmic sniffing. The kind of sniffing you only hear from something big. I sat up, pulse hammering against my ribs. I didn't want to believe what it could be. I told myself it was the wind again, or a branch, or some clueless raccoon digging for scraps. But the sound was too heavy, too slow, too intentional. Whatever was outside knew I was inside. Another sniff. Another exhale. Wet, guttural, almost human in its depth. I swung my legs out from the bed and flattened my feet against the cold floor. Every instinct screamed at me to stay perfectly still. I reached for the small flashlight beside the counter, but the metal clinked too loudly when I picked it up, and the moment it did, the sniffing stopped. I froze. The silence pressed against me like a hand around my throat. Then came the sound I can still hear if a room gets too quiet, the unmistakable scratch of claws sliding down the side of my RV. Slow, testing, curious. The creature traced the metal paneling like it was reading Braille, like it could feel me through the walls. I swallowed hard. I wanted to look through the window, but every horror story I'd ever heard warned me not to. You don't meet the eyes of something that isn't afraid of you. The scratching moved toward the door, then the door handle rattled. I felt the blood drain from my face. That cheap metal handle, the one I'd always meant to replace, shook once, then again, harder. The entire door flexed inward with the force of the pull. That's when I knew it wasn't a raccoon, or a deer, or anything small enough to scare away. The breath on the other side of the door was deep enough to vibrate through the frame. A bear. A full-grown bear trying to get inside. Dread seeped into my bones, slow, cold, paralyzing. I backed away from the door, step by step, not looking away from that trembling handle. The RV creaked beneath its weight as the bear leaned into it. A heavy groan echoed through the thin metal walls, and the door frame bent another quarter-inch. It was trying to force its way in. My mind scrambled. Had I left food out? Did I track scents inside? Did the bear smell something on me, or something inside me? Something desperate? Something afraid? The bear huffed, low and irritated, and pressed harder. The hinges squealed. The whole frame shuddered. Then came the moment I can never forget. The sound of nails digging against the seam of the door, trying to pry it open. The bear wasn't just sniffing or testing. It was breaking in. Panic hit me like ice water. My breath came sharp and fast, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I grabbed the only thing I had near me, a metal skillet, and held it like a shield, knowing damn well it was useless. The bear growled. Not loud, deep, a warning, a declaration, a promise. It slammed its weight into the door so hard that the whole RV pitched to the right, throwing me against the counter. A cup fell and shattered at my feet. The bear heard it and roared, an explosive, guttural sound that filled the entire RV like thunder trapped in a tin can. The instinct to run surged through me, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped in a metal box with a predator trying to peel it open like a cheap can of food. Time distorted. Every second stretched. Every breath sounded like it came from someone about to die. The bear stepped away for a moment. I could hear it circling. The thud of its steps sounded heavier than anything I had ever imagined. Each footfall a reminder of how powerless I was. It came to the back window, sniffed, scratched, huffed, then moved again. It was searching for a weak point. The bathroom window, the emergency hatch above the bed, any seam it could widen. I heard it climb onto the side of the RV, claws clamping onto the ladder. The metal groaned hard enough to make my teeth ache. Then, horrifyingly, it got onto the roof. The entire RV depressed under its weight. Dust rained from the ceiling. The bear paced above me, each step making the structure bend. I crouched beneath the cabinets, arms around my knees, rocking slightly without realizing it, not praying, not hoping, just waiting. The bear stopped directly above me. It shifted its weight, settled its weight, and then it started pawing at the roof hatch. A soft crack spidered across the plastic cover. Another deeper crack followed. The bear grunted and pushed harder, lifting part of the latch. I felt something inside me splinter. Fear didn't just rise, it consumed. A primal kind of fear, older than language, older than memory. The fear of being prey. "Please," I whispered without thinking. "Please, not like this." The bear paused, not because it understood me, because headlights swept across the campground, a car coming in late, its engine humming, tires crunching gravel. The bear stiffened, listening. Then it huffed one last breath through the vent, heavy and frustrated, before climbing down the far side of the RV. I heard it move into the trees, branches cracking under its retreat, until the sound faded into the deep black of the forest. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally stood, my legs were trembling so badly I had to lean against the wall. The RV was dented, scratched, nearly broken open in 2 places. The door frame hung crooked, and the roof vent was cracked enough to let in thin lines of moonlight. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat at the little dinette table, skillet still in my hand, flinching at every whisper of wind. When the sun rose, I stepped outside. The ground was covered in paw prints, massive, deliberate, the kind that make you feel small, fragile, temporary. A ranger arrived within minutes, saw the damage, and shook her head with a mix of sympathy and warning. "You're lucky," she said quietly. "You never want to bear that curious." Lucky. I didn't feel lucky, but I felt something else, humbled, shaken awake, pulled out of the fog I'd been living in for months. That bear didn't just break into my campsite that night. It broke into the part of me that had forgotten how close danger always is when you ignore your instincts out here and in your own life. Fear taught me something. Respect taught me something. And survival, unexpected, undeserved, taught me something too. I left Yellowstone with dents in my RV, but clarity in my mind. I'm not invincible. None of us are. And the wilderness doesn't care how tired you are or how much you think you deserve peace. It only asks one thing, that you pay attention. Because sometimes the unexpected visitor knocking on your door isn't there to hurt you. Sometimes it's there to wake you. And that night in Wyoming, I woke up. The first thing I remember from that night wasn't the storm itself. It was the smell. The strange, metallic scent that rolls in right before a flash flood. People who haven't lived through one don't know what I mean. But when you're out on the Colorado Plateau long enough, you learn the land has its own breath. And that shift in the air is how it whispers a warning. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 38, and I've been traveling in a beat-up Volkswagen Westphalia, living off and on the road for nearly a decade. I've camped in places where lightning crawled across the sky like living veins, where coyotes circled close enough to see the whites of their eyes, where the desert felt like it was staring back. But nothing, not in all my years out there, felt as personal, as intimate as the night the storm hit the plateau in 2022 and nearly took me with it. I'd set up camp near a dry wash a few miles outside Hanksville, Utah, thinking it was safe. Locals always say the same thing to newcomers. If you see a wash, don't sleep near it. I thought I was far enough. I was wrong. The sky that afternoon had been strangely silent, almost too blue, the kind of deceptive calm you don't recognize as danger until you've lived through the consequences. The sun had that harsh, white-hot glare that makes the mesas look like they're vibrating. Heat shimmered off the rocks, and the only sound was the occasional crackle of dry brush shifting in the wind. It felt peaceful, wide open, safe. But peace isn't the same as safety on the plateau. I'd been out there partly for photography, partly because being alone in the desert was how I tried to clear my head these days. I'd been carrying around this tight, knotted feeling in my chest for months. Work stress, family expectations, a relationship that ended badly, and left me feeling like I couldn't trust my own instincts anymore. Out in the desert, you hear yourself differently, and you hear the things you try not to admit. So I parked the Westie on a patch of gravel, popped the top, set out my chair, and spent the afternoon just breathing in the stillness. I kept telling myself I needed this trip. I needed quiet. I needed to remind myself I still knew what danger looked like. But that was the thing. I didn't. Not anymore. Around dusk, the wind picked up in these short, nervous bursts, like someone exhaling sharply behind me. I remember looking up from my camp stove, beans and rice, nothing fancy, and noticing how the sky had shifted from that bright blue to a bruised, purple-gray smear. Storms roll in fast on the plateau, but this one looked wrong. It wasn't building above me. It was building around me, closing in from every horizon like a tightening noose. I should have folded camp right then. I knew better. But I felt this stubborn need to prove to myself that I wasn't overreacting, that my fear wasn't guiding me. I'd spent so much of the past year being told I was too paranoid, too sensitive, too quick to see danger where there was none, and out there, alone with my thoughts, I tried to fight that instinct. So I stayed. I sat back in my chair, listened to the stove hiss, watched the sky pulse with distant lightning. It wasn't hitting the ground yet, just flashing deep inside the clouds, like a warning heartbeat. I kept telling myself, it's far away, it'll pass. But the thing about storms on the plateau is that they don't have to hit you directly to kill you. Rain falling 20 miles away can sweep into a canyon like a wall of black glass and erase everything in its path. Every year, someone ignores the warnings. Every year, someone disappears. That night, it almost happened to me. By the time the first wind gust slammed against the van, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. The air tasted like copper. The desert went from sunset orange to charcoal in seconds. A low rumble rolled through the ground, not thunder, not yet, just the sound of the land reacting. I scrambled to pack up my gear, hands shaking harder than I wanted to admit. I tossed everything inside the Westphalia, not caring where it landed, then slammed the sliding door so hard it rattled. Rain started tapping on the roof, soft at first, then harder, sharp, angry like fingertips drumming faster and faster. I turned the key in the ignition. Click, just a click. My stomach dropped. I tried again. Click. The van, my home, my shelter, my escape plan, dead. I felt this icy panic creep up my spine. My breathing turned shallow. My hands felt numb on the steering wheel. I kept telling myself not to lose it, not to fall apart. But the rain was hitting the roof so hard now it sounded like gravel dumping out of a truck. The wind rocked the van side to side, and the wash dry an hour ago started carrying the sound of rushing water. That's when I realized the truth. I wasn't far enough from the wash, and it was filling. I grabbed my flashlight and rain jacket, threw open the van door, and the wind nearly ripped it out of my hands. Rain blasted sideways against my face, cold and violent. I shined the light toward the wash. Water was already churning through it, thick, muddy, foaming, rising by the second. And I wasn't parked on safe ground like I'd convinced myself. I was on a slope. A shallow one, yes, but a slope that angled directly toward the wash. The land had been quiet all day, too quiet. And now it was coming alive with a force that felt ancient and indifferent. I ran to the back of the van, thinking maybe I could push it, maybe I could rock it enough to get the engine to catch, maybe. But deep down, I knew none of that made sense. The van weighed more than I did, and the rain was filling the wash so fast that the sound shifted from a roar to something deeper, heavier, like the rumble of an approaching train. I aimed my light down again. The water was inches from spilling over the bank. And once it crossed that line, the ground under my van would become part of the flood. The panic that hit me wasn't cinematic or dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was small, tight, cold. Like someone pinched my heart between two fingers and squeezed. I kept swallowing hard, trying to keep my thoughts straight to remember what the park rangers had told me once. Flash floods don't rise. They arrive. And this one was arriving faster than my brain could process. I staggered back to the driver's side door, rain soaking through my jacket, mud splashing up around my boots. I tried the ignition again. Click, click, click. That was when the first real bolt of lightning hit somewhere nearby, close enough that the ground vibrated under my feet. The thunder cracked a half-second later, so loud it felt like something tore open above me. My instincts finally snapped back into place. This wasn't about the van anymore. If I stayed, I'd die. I stepped out into the storm, chest pounding, flashlight beam shaking in my hand. Behind me, the water surged again. This time it sounded like it was climbing. The moment I stepped away from the van, the storm swallowed me. Rain hammered the earth so hard it felt like walking through a curtain of nails. The beam of my flashlight barely cut more than a few feet ahead, just swirling sheets of water, blurred sagebrush, and the shifting outline of the Westphalia behind me. I knew I needed higher ground, even if it was only a few feet. Any elevation could mean the difference between being swept under or staying alive long enough for the storm to pass. But the thing people don't understand about the Colorado Plateau is that the terrain plays tricks on you when it floods. The dips, the gullies, the subtle slopes that look harmless in daylight become traps, basins where water gathers, channels where runoff slices through like liquid blades. My instinct was to run straight north toward the rocky rise I remembered from earlier. But in the storm, my sense of direction narrowed into something fuzzy and unreliable. The landscape, all orange and ochre an hour ago, was reduced to shadows. The wind pushed against me so hard I had to lean into it to keep my balance. Every few seconds, lightning cracked open the sky, freezing everything into a white snapshot. The van behind me, the wash swelling like a living thing, and the ground beneath my feet glistening with the first layer of accumulating runoff. Then, in the next flash, I saw the impossible. The water had reached the tires of my van. Not a gradual creep, not a slow rise, just suddenly there. Like the storm had decided to skip forward in time. I lurched forward, boots slipping in the mud, heart thudding in my throat. I kept thinking, stupidly, irrationally, no, I can't lose it. Not the van. Not everything I own. Losing the Westphalia wasn't just losing shelter. It was losing identity. Losing the way I coped with the world. It was the one constant I had left. But survival doesn't negotiate. When the water surged again, a dark wave washing over the gravel, something inside me snapped. The fear stopped being a scream and became a kind of cold command. Move. I stumbled toward the rise, flashlight bouncing wildly. The mud sucked at my boots with every step. I went down twice, once on my hands, once to my knees, each time catching myself before sliding farther downhill. Every time I paused, even for half a second, I felt the tremor of the draining wash, like the land itself was shuddering under the weight of the water. The rain hit harder, the wind howled louder, and somewhere behind me, metal groaned. I whipped around. Lightning cracked above, and in that frozen, blinding instant, I saw the Westphalia tilt. Just a few inches. Just enough for the floodwater to nudge it sideways. That image burned into me. The van slowly turning like a wounded animal trying to rise. I wanted to go back. God, every instinct screamed at me to go back. But another part of me, the part that had been quiet for too long, finally spoke with clarity. If you go back, you die with it. The storm didn't care about sentimental attachments. I forced myself forward, legs shaking, lungs burning from the cold. The rain soaked through every layer I had, turning my jacket heavy, my jeans plastered to my skin. My hands were so numb I couldn't feel the flashlight anymore. I only knew I was holding it because its beam bobbed when I stumbled. A flash flood doesn't roar continuously. It ebbs and surges like a monstrous heartbeat. And behind me, the land throbbed with each pulse. The rush of water grew louder, deeper, almost closer. Halfway up the rocky rise, the slope steepened. The mud thinned into slippery sandstone, which should have been a blessing, except the water was now cascading down the rock like a broken dam, trying to push me backward. I scrambled on all fours, each movement a fight against gravity and panic. I don't know how long it took me to reach the small plateau. Maybe 2 minutes, maybe 10. Time doesn't behave normally during panic. It contracts and stretches like it's tied to your breath. When I finally hauled myself onto the higher ground, I collapsed onto my knees, gasping. The wind howled above the rocks, and the rain stung my face like shards of ice. I turned around just in time for a lightning bolt to flare across the horizon. The van was floating. Not fully, just enough that the tires were no longer touching ground. The water lifted it as effortlessly as a leaf. And then, with a sickening lurch, the Westphalia tipped onto its side and slammed into the swirling current of the wash. I shouted, whether in denial or grief or disbelief, I still don't know. The sound vanished immediately into the storm. All I could do was watch as the van, the place where I'd slept through countless desert nights, the place where I'd hidden from my own anxiety more times than I could count, was dragged away like driftwood, twisting, rolling, breaking, a flash of metal, a crunching roar, and then it disappeared into the dark throat of the canyon. The loneliness that hit me wasn't quiet. It was violent. A hollowing out, like losing the van suddenly stripped away the buffer between me and every fear I'd been keeping at arm's length. The plateau stretched around me in every direction, vast, ancient, indifferent, and for the first time I felt genuinely, utterly exposed. I crouched low, trying to shield my body from the wind, forcing myself to think. I needed shelter. I needed warmth. I needed a way to survive the night. Lightning illuminated the terrain repeatedly, each flash revealing more water running across the desert floor. What had been dry land was now a maze of temporary rivers. I knew the storm wouldn't last forever, but flash floods don't wait for storms to finish. They keep moving long after the rain stops, gathering strength from every tributary and canyon upstream. If I stayed where I was, I'd survive the water. Maybe. But hypothermia, exposure, that was another threat altogether. I scanned the area, every nerve buzzing. On the far side of the rise, maybe 50 feet away, I spotted what looked like the outline of a shallow overhang, a rock shelf hugging the cliffside. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to shield me from the direct wind and maybe block some of the rain. I crawled toward it, sliding on the wet rock, heart pounding with every flash of lightning. Once I reached the overhang, I wedged myself beneath it, hugging my knees to my chest. The space was cramped, but it felt like safety compared to the chaos outside. I steadied my breathing as best I could, fighting off the tremors that were starting to shake through my body. Every fear I had, every moment of self-doubt, every time I'd second-guessed my instincts over the past year, pressed in on me. I realized brutally that I'd ignored every warning the land had given me because I was afraid of being overly cautious. Yet here I was, alone, alive, but barely, and with nowhere left to hide from my own mind. The storm raged for what felt like hours. The plateau shook with thunder, the air vibrating with each crack. Water roared through the dark, carving new paths through the earth. At one point, the wind screamed through the rocks with such force that the overhang seemed to tremble, and I held my breath, half expecting it to collapse. When the lightning eased and the thunder softened into distant rumbles, the fear didn't leave. It changed, shifted, settled into something heavier. A realization sank into me, slow and cold. No one knew where I was. No one would come looking tonight. If the temperatures dropped any lower, the rain could kill me before the flood did. And somewhere down in the darkness, the van, the last piece of my old life, was being torn apart, piece by piece, by a force I couldn't fight or outrun. For the first time all night, tears blurred my vision. I wiped them away, angry at myself, not because crying was weak, but because it wasted energy I needed to survive. I leaned my head back against the cold sandstone and whispered the truth I'd been avoiding. I wasn't just fighting the storm. I was fighting the part of myself that had stopped trusting my own fear. And up on that lonely rise, shivering, soaked to the bone, watching the desert reshape itself in the dark, I felt something shift inside me, a resolve I hadn't known I still had. This wasn't over, and I wasn't done fighting. The storm eased sometime after midnight, but the quiet that followed felt nothing like relief. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, that makes your pulse sound too loud in your own skull. I stayed wedged beneath the shallow overhang until the rain thinned into scattered drips and the wind softened into distant sweeps across the mesa. When I finally crawled out, every muscle in my body ached. My clothes clung to me like a second, icy skin. The flashlight flickered in my hand, the batteries soaked and dying, but it managed to throw a weak beam across the rocky rise. The world below had changed. Where I'd parked the Westphalia was now a smear of mud and water, like someone had wiped a hand across the desert and erased everything. The wash had broadened into a raging brown current, still frothing at the edges. The roar of it had quieted, but the menace hadn't gone anywhere. It surged through the canyon like something alive, relentless, unbothered by whatever or whoever it took with it. I stared into that dark water for a long time. The van was gone. My gear, my clothes, my food, every part of the life I'd built on the road, gone. The loss hit harder out here than it would have anywhere else. In the cities, you lose something and feel the inconvenience. In the wilderness, you lose something and feel the consequences. My breath trembled in the cold air, my fingers were numb, my mind kept slipping into that dangerous space where panic disguises itself as logic. Maybe I can follow the wash downstream. Maybe I can catch up to the van. I forced those thoughts down. I knew better. I'd hiked enough slot canyons to understand that flash floods don't just take objects, they pulverize them. Even if the van had survived the initial hit, it could have been carried miles, scraped against sandstone walls until it was unrecognizable. Following the wash in the dark was suicide. I turned away from the water and scanned the terrain. Without the storm, the plateau looked wider, lonelier. The mesas hunched in the distance like oversized silhouettes against a moon-veiled sky. Pools of rainwater reflected jagged lightning on the horizon. The air smelled like wet clay, sage, and something else. Something sharp and raw, the scent of earth that's been torn open. I needed warmth, shelter, a plan. My legs shook as I climbed farther up the rise, searching for a better view. When I reached the top, the wind cut across the rock and sent a fresh shiver through me. In the far distance, I saw faint dots of light. Maybe 10 miles out, maybe more. Hanksville. Civilization, or at least the closest thing to it out here. But 10 miles in freezing wind, soaked clothes, and unstable terrain wasn't a path. It was a gamble. Lightning flickered again, revealing something I hadn't seen before, an old mining road cutting down the backside of the ridge. It wound through sandstone formations, partly washed out, barely visible unless the sky lit up at the right angle. I didn't know exactly where it led, but it headed away from the rising water and toward the more stable highlands. That was enough. I started down the road, feet slipping on wet stone, breath clouding in front of me. The darkness felt heavier here, the silence deeper. Every time thunder rolled in the distance, I flinched, expecting the rain to return with the same fury. Trauma doesn't wait for morning. It rewrites your instincts right away. Half an hour passed, maybe more. The cold gnawed at my bones. My flashlight died completely, leaving me with nothing but the dim, shifting glow of the storm to the east. I followed the road by feel, one hand on the sandstone wall, tracing its uneven surface. My boots squelched with every step. My teeth chattered. I felt hollow, stripped down, raw. But beneath all that fear, something else had begun to grow, a sharper clarity than I'd felt in months. Every step was a choice. Every movement forward meant I hadn't given up. And out here, choosing to survive was its own kind of rebellion. About an hour into the walk, I heard it. A low rumble behind me, deeper than thunder, steadier than wind. I froze. The sound grew louder, rolling across the desert in a rising wave. It was the wash, the secondary surge. The one rangers told stories about, the delayed flood that builds miles upstream and hits long after the rain stops. I whipped my head toward the canyon I'd left. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then the sound turned into something unmistakable. The grinding, snarling roar of water devouring everything in its path. The plateau trembled under my feet. My heart slammed into my ribs. If the second surge rose high enough to spill into these gullies, I'd be caught on open rock with nothing but cold air and darkness to shield me. I broke into a staggering run. The old mining road dipped and climbed unpredictably, each step a risk on slick stone. The cold had stiffened my legs, but adrenaline burned through the stiffness. Rocks shifted under my boots. At one point, my foot slid out from under me, and I slammed hard onto my side. Pain shot through my ribs. I pushed myself up with a groan and kept moving. The rumble behind me grew louder, closer. The sound wrapped around the canyon walls, magnifying into something monstrous. I couldn't see the water yet, but I could feel it. A vibration. A warning, a countdown. I pushed harder, lungs burning, legs shaking, until the road curved sharply between two towering sandstone pillars. The narrow gap funneled the wind, creating a whistle that echoed off the walls. The darkness beyond looked deeper, almost like a cave. For one terrifying moment, I hesitated. Going in blind could be a trap. Staying out meant being overtaken by the surge. I clenched my jaw and stepped forward. Inside, the space widened into a sheltered alcove, a natural wind pocket carved over centuries. The ceiling was low, but the ground rose just high enough that the floodwaters would have to climb 20 feet to reach it. For the first time all night, I let out a shaky exhale of relief. I backed into the alcove, pressing myself against the rock wall. My chest heaved. My hair dripped cold water down my neck. The world outside turned pitch black again. Then I heard it. The surge exploding through the canyon below. Not a roar, a detonation. Water slammed through the landscape, smashing against rock, tearing through brush, ripping at the earth with the kind of power you only respect when you're close enough to feel it in your bones. The sound filled the air, vibrating up the walls, rattling through my teeth. If I'd been 2 minutes slower, I wouldn't have survived. I closed my eyes and let the waves of sound pass over me. Fear pulsed through my veins, but alongside it was something more complicated. Shame, because I doubted my instincts. Anger, because I'd known better and ignored it. Grief, because the van wasn't coming back. Determination, because I refused to let this night decide the rest of my life. I curled my arms around myself, trying to borrow warmth from my own body. The wind outside still carried the storm's aftertaste, wet earth, sagebrush, and that metallic scent that lingered long after the danger passed. Minutes blurred into an hour, maybe more. The surge eventually softened into a distant rumble, fading into the kind of silence that follows destruction. I pushed myself upright, ribs aching. The cold had sunk so deep into me I felt brittle, like one wrong movement would make me crack. But I had survived the worst of it. Now came the part that scared me in a different way. Morning. Not because daylight was dangerous, but because daylight meant I'd see everything the flood had taken, everything the storm had revealed about me, everything I'd tried not to admit. I didn't know what I'd do when the sun came up. I didn't know if I'd find help or walk until my legs gave out. I didn't know if I'd ever see another RV site on the plateau without hearing that surge again, without smelling rain in a way that tightened something in my spine. But I knew one thing. If I made it through the night, I'd never ignore my instincts again. Not out here. Not anywhere. So I pulled myself deeper into the alcove, pressed my back against the cold sandstone, and waited for the first hint of morning light. The signal that I'd earned another chance, and that the desert, in its own brutal way, still allowed me to keep it. Morning came slowly to the Colorado Plateau, not as a burst of sunlight, but as a pale wash of gray that seeped into the world inch by inch. I'd been shivering for hours, muscles cramped, joints stiff, and my mind drifting in and out of that dangerous fog where exhaustion masquerades as calm. But when the first thin band of light touched the edge of the alcove, it felt like a rope thrown into deep water. I forced myself to move. My hands were clumsy, stiff from the cold, and when I pushed myself upright, a sharp pain speared through my ribs. I hissed under my breath and waited for the wave to pass. The flood had battered the landscape, but the night had battered me too. When I stepped out onto the sandstone ledge, the world below looked wrong. Not unfamiliar, not destroyed, just rearranged, reshaped by the storm like a sculptor with violent hands. The wash that had swallowed my van was wider, deeper, a gash of muddy water still surging at its center. The banks had collapsed in places, forming jagged scars along the canyon walls. Sagebrush lay uprooted. Sandstone boulders, which must have weighed hundreds of pounds, had been rolled far from where they originally rested. It was destruction without malice, just pure, unstoppable force. For a long moment, I could only stand there and stare. This was what the storm had done in a single night. This was what I had almost become part of. The wind had finally softened into a cool, steady breeze that carried the scent of wet earth and pine from somewhere far off. Clouds drifted low across the sky, tinged with faint rose and lavender. The beauty felt eerie, like the land was pretending it hadn't tried to kill me. I scanned the terrain, heart sinking with the heavy truth. There was no sign of the Westphalia, no shimmer of metal, no torn scrap of fabric, no familiar shape half buried in silt. It was simply gone, claimed by the storm in a way that was absolute. A part of me wanted to climb down and follow the wash, to search the beaten mud until I found even one recognizable piece, something to hold on to, something to keep. But another part of me, a part I hadn't listened to for too long, quietly told the truth. The van wasn't my safety anymore. It wasn't coming back. And if I followed the flood, I might not come back either. I took a slow breath, tasting the bitter mix of grief and acceptance. Loss in the wilderness feels different than loss in the rest of the world. Out here, there's no one to witness it, no one to comfort you. You learn how to sit with it, let it settle in your chest, and then move anyway. I turned away from the wash. The mining road looked different in daylight. Still damaged, still partially collapsed, but more navigable. The storm had torn away loose debris, revealing the hard-packed stone beneath. I took one step, then another, feeling the stiffness begin to ease from my legs as they warmed. The morning air was cold, but no longer dangerous. The kind of cold that woke you up instead of numbing you down. I followed the road north, moving carefully between boulders and rivulets of leftover runoff. The desert was never silent, not truly, but the post-storm hush felt reverent. I could hear distant bird calls, the faint trickle of settling water, and the quiet scrape of my boots on stone. With each sound, the night's terror felt a little farther away, though not forgotten. It lingered like a bruise on my mind, tender, undeniable. As I walked, I tried to piece together the hours before the storm hit, replaying every small decision I'd made. Parking too close to the wash, ignoring the shift in the wind, fighting that instinct that told me to move. I wasn't inexperienced. I wasn't reckless. I just stopped trusting myself. That was the truth I didn't want to face. Trusting fear doesn't make you weak out here. It makes you alive. The rising sun caught the edge of a rock spire ahead, lighting it up in a soft gold glow. The sight gave me a strange surge of hope. The desert always found ways to remind you that beauty and danger lived side by side, and that surviving one didn't take away the other. 2 hours passed before I saw signs of civilization. At first, it was just a thin wooden post, a faded trail marker, weather-beaten but still standing. Then in the distance, the faint glint of metal, an old fence running along a cattle line, and eventually, a dirt road cutting across the plateau, muddy but intact. My pace quickened despite the pain in my ribs. When I finally stepped onto the dirt road, gravel crunching beneath my boots, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly buckled my knees. This road wasn't used often, but it was used enough. Someone would come through. Maybe today. Maybe in a few hours. But staying still after what I just lived through felt impossible. So I kept walking, heading toward the direction of Hanksville. The sun climbed higher, warming my shoulders. My soaked clothes dried slowly under the growing heat. My breath steadied into a rhythm. And for the first time since the storm began, I felt something like control again. I walked another mile before I heard the sound, distant at first, then growing clearer. The hum of an engine. A real one, not imagined, not hoped for. A vehicle moving across the plateau. I turned, eyes scanning the dusty horizon until a white pickup truck appeared, bouncing along the road toward me. Relief hit me so hard I had to swallow it down just to stay upright. When the truck slowed and stopped beside me, the driver leaned out the window. A man in his 60s, sun-tanned face, weathered eyes that looked like they'd seen more storms than I could imagine. "Morning," he said, taking in my soaked clothes, my shaking hands, my hollow expression. "That storm hit you hard, didn't it?" I let out a breath that felt like it'd been trapped inside me all night. "Yeah," I managed. "I lost my van. Everything." The man nodded slowly, not with pity, but with the quiet understanding of someone who knew the land well enough to respect it. "Flash floods don't give back what they take," he said. "But you're alive. That's what counts." I climbed into the passenger seat, wincing as the movement sent another jolt through my ribs. The warmth of the truck wrapped around me instantly, almost painfully comforting. As we drove toward town, the man asked what happened. I told him, haltingly at first, then in more detail as the reality of survival sank in. He listened without interrupting, hands steady on the wheel, eyes scanning the road and the horizon with the calm attention of someone who trusted his instincts. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You did the right thing," he said finally. "A lot of people freeze when floods come. They think they can outrun it. They think they can save their things. You chose to save yourself." His words shouldn't have mattered as much as they did, but they did, because he was right about something else too. The desert doesn't give back what it takes, but it does give you something if you survive it. Perspective. When we reached the outskirts of Hanksville, the rising sun painted the sandstone cliffs with a warm glow. Dust kicked up behind the truck tires. The town was quiet, still waking up, unaware of the storm's violence just miles away. But I knew, and the land knew. And somewhere deep inside, something in me shifted. I hadn't just survived the flood. I'd survived the part of myself that kept doubting every instinct, every warning, every whisper of fear that tried to protect me. The storm stripped everything away so I could see the truth beneath it. And as the truck rolled toward town, warmth returning to my fingers, sunlight touching my face, I realized I was ready for whatever came next, even if it meant starting over from nothing. The emergency clinic in Hanksville wasn't much more than a converted double-wide, but the lights were warm and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar. The nurse wrapped my ribs, checked for hypothermia, and gave me a blanket that felt like it held the sun in its threads. When she asked where I'd been camped during the storm, I watched her eyebrows lift above her glasses. "You're lucky," she murmured. "Flash floods this season have been nastier than usual. We haven't found everyone." The words stuck with me long after I left. The town itself was still waking up, storefronts unlocking, the diner humming, a handful of RVs dusted in red earth parked along the main road. People nodded politely, the way small-town folks do when they recognize danger has brushed past you. There wasn't pity in their eyes, just understanding, and that quiet respect reserved for anyone who's lived through a night the desert meant to claim. The man who rescued me, his name was Harold, waited nearby while I filled out some paperwork. When I stepped out into the cool morning light, he handed me a steaming cup of black coffee. "Figured you could use it," he said. The first sip burned my tongue, but it warmed something deeper too, something I didn't realize had gone cold long before the storm. We walked to the bench outside the clinic, sat in silence, watching the sun climb over the ridge. After a while, he said, "You know, storms like that, they don't just reshape the land. They reshape a person, strip things down, make you ask yourself what actually matters." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice yet. "Losing a home on wheels," he continued. "It hits harder, because it wasn't just a van, was it?" "No," I said softly. "It wasn't." He glanced at me, waited. "It was the one place I ever felt steady," I admitted. When everything else felt unpredictable, the road made sense, the routines made sense. That van was the last thing I could rely on. Harold nodded again, as if he'd already known. "The desert has a way of testing what you lean on," he said. "Sometimes it takes what you think you can't lose, so you remember what you're actually made of." His words caught me off guard. Not because they were comforting, but because they were true in a way I hadn't voiced aloud. It wasn't just the storm that had shaken me. It was the realization that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped trusting myself. The instincts I'd honed through years of travel had dulled under the weight of everything I'd been carrying. Stress, heartbreak, the fear of repeating past mistakes. I'd been trying so hard not to overreact, not to seem fragile, that I'd silenced the part of me built to keep me alive. And that nearly cost me everything. I stayed in Hanksville for 2 days, slept at a small roadside cabin rental the clinic arranged, ate more hot meals than I'd had in weeks, watched the sky from the porch, and listened to the desert settle back into its usual rhythm. But the storm stayed with me, in the creak of the porch boards at night, in the distant rumble of trucks on the highway, in the way water pooled along the roadside after a minor drizzle and made my breath catch. Trauma doesn't leave quietly. It lingers. It whispers. It waits for you to listen. On the third morning, I borrowed a map from the cabin owner who marked a route leading to a rancher's outpost that connected back to a bus line. Before leaving town, though, I walked out to a bluff overlooking the very plateau that had nearly become my grave. The sky was clear, a deep, endless blue that gave no hint of the violence it had unleashed days earlier. The land looked peaceful again. Beautiful, even. But the storm had changed it. And me. I stood there for a long time, letting the quiet seep in. The anxiety I'd carried before the storm felt different now, less like a shadow and more like a reminder. Fear wasn't the enemy. It wasn't weakness. It was a voice, a compass, something that didn't want to scare me, but save me, and I'd ignored it for too long. I placed my hand on my bandaged ribs, took a slow breath, and whispered something I needed to hear out loud, even if no one else did. I'm not broken. I just wasn't listening. The wind carried the words out across the mesa. Leaving Hanksville felt bittersweet. I didn't want to return to city life. I didn't want to abandon the road forever. But I also knew I couldn't just replace the van and pretend nothing had happened. The storm had taken the shell I'd been hiding in, and maybe that was the point. Harold offered me a ride to the ranch outpost, a couple hours north, rough roads, open desert. When we arrived, he stepped out and helped me unload the small pack of supplies the townspeople had put together. Before I climbed aboard the outbound bus, he said something that stayed with me. Son, surviving out here isn't about strength. It's about paying attention. The land talks, the sky talks, your gut talks. You listen to all three, and you'll be fine. I nodded, but he wasn't finished. You stop listening, and the desert will remind you the hard way. I knew exactly what he meant. The bus pulled away slowly, dust trailing behind like a fading note. Through the window, I watched Harold shrink into the landscape until he became just another piece of the plateau. Weathered, sturdy, quietly enduring. As the miles rolled beneath the tires, I closed my eyes and let the motion steady my breath. I didn't know where I was headed next. Didn't know what kind of rig I'd eventually replace the Westphalia with. Didn't know if I'd return to this part of Utah anytime soon. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Fear wasn't something to deny or outrun. It was something to understand, to respect, to use. The storm had taken my home on wheels, but it had given me something back, the instinct I'd buried beneath doubt and noise, the part of me that knew when danger was coming, the part of me that had tried to warn me long before the first raindrop hit the roof. By the time the bus crossed into the next county, the sun had shifted to late afternoon. Warm bands of light stretched across the cab, touching my face, my hands, the worn edges of the blanket the nurse had given me. I let the warmth sink in deep. Let the fear settle where it belonged, behind me, not inside me. Let the lesson take shape in a way I'd never forget. Survival isn't an accident. It's a choice made long before the worst night comes. And when the next storm finds me, because storms always do, I won't argue with my instincts. I won't downplay the signs. I won't let anyone tell me my fear is exaggeration. The land talks, the sky talks, and now, finally, I'm ready to listen. The night the fog swallowed the sky over Crater Lake, I learned that silence can be more dangerous than any growling animal or snapping twig in the dark. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 41, and I've spent the better part of my adult life wandering across the American West in my old Volkswagen camper van. A rust-speckled forest green relic from 1978 that rattled like a box of bolts but felt more like home than any apartment I have ever rented. I've camped through storms that shook mountain passes, slept beside deserts so quiet I could hear my heartbeat. And I've always believed that with enough experience, enough intuition, enough respect for the land, nothing could catch me off guard anymore. But the night I parked along the rim road near Crater Lake in late September of 2021, I realized how foolish that confidence really was. I remember the first whisper of unease creeping in before anything truly happened. It was already dusk when I arrived, a soft blue settling over the ancient caldera. The lake below looked impossibly still, like a giant bowl of ink, so dark it seemed bottomless. I'd been driving for 8 hours and wanted nothing more than to drink some coffee, stretch out my legs, and breathe in the cold alpine air. The place was nearly empty. Summer crowds had disappeared weeks earlier, and there were no RVs lined up at the pullouts, no headlights weaving through the trees. Just me. Just the quiet. And yet, even then, something about that quiet felt wrong, too complete, hollow in a way I couldn't immediately explain. I shook it off, told myself I was just tired. I backed the Volkswagen into a level spot just past a bend in the road, killed the engine, and stepped out into the cooling air. The wind barely moved. The pines stood so still they could have been carved from stone. I walked toward the overlook to admire the lake one last time before darkness settled, but by the time I'd taken 10 steps, a thin ribbon of fog rolled across the water like a ghost drifting toward shore. At first, it was beautiful, dramatic, something worth photographing. Then another ribbon followed, then more. All at once, the lake vanished beneath a rising wall of white that crept upward like it had a purpose, like it knew exactly where it wanted to go. I should have taken that as a sign. Inside the van, I tried to relax, made dinner, jotted some notes in my journal. But for reasons I couldn't articulate, the hairs on my arms kept standing up. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing toward the windows, expecting to see something pressed against the glass, and then the smell drifted in. It wasn't the forest or the damp scent of cold water rising. It was metallic, like wet steel, like the air inside a basement that's been locked up too long. I opened the side door to let fresh air in and felt my chest tighten. The fog had consumed everything. I couldn't see the trees. I couldn't see the road. I couldn't see my own hand unless it was inches from my face. The world had become a white cocoon, muffling sound, swallowing distance. And yet, through all that suffocating silence, something was moving out there. At first, it was soft, too soft to tell if it was real or just my imagination twitching at shadows within the fog, a faint crunch, then another. The deliberate sound of steps on gravel, slow and spaced out like whoever or whatever was walking, wasn't in a hurry. I told myself it had to be a deer, maybe a stray hiker, maybe someone else had pulled off the road without me noticing. But each step landed with a weight that bowed the dirt in a way I felt more than heard, a heaviness animals rarely carry. And the steps were getting closer. The rational part of me tried to take control. I locked the van doors, pulled the curtains closed, sat on the bench and forced slow breaths. But my mind wouldn't cooperate. Every instinct was screaming that something was wrong with the fog, like it wasn't just weather, but something alive, something that moved with intention rather than drift. My ears strained to track the footsteps outside, but the fog played tricks on sound, bouncing it, stretching it, twisting it until I couldn't tell what direction anything came from. Then the knocking started, a faint tap on the passenger side window, just one. So soft it could have been a branch brushing the glass. I held still, frozen, heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. A long moment passed. Then another tap, this one slightly firmer, as if testing the material. I didn't breathe, didn't move. My mind raced through every story I'd ever heard from fellow campers. Stories of people who disappeared in national parks, stories of animals behaving strangely before storms, stories of humans pretending to be in trouble just to lure others outside. But this knocking didn't feel human. It felt deliberate in a different way, patient, like something trying to understand me. I gathered the courage to peel back the curtain just a sliver, and I saw nothing. Just the white swirling fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. But the knocking continued, moving from window to window, drifting around the van in a slow circle. Tap near the rear hatch, tap by the sliding door, tap at the windshield. Each one spaced perfectly apart, like whatever was out there was walking a measured pattern. I whispered to myself, "Stay inside. Just stay inside." But the human brain hates unanswered questions. It hates the unknown more than it hates danger, and soon fear mixed with a strange, stubborn curiosity. I reached for my flashlight, hands trembling, and positioned myself behind the sliding door. I listened. The knocking had stopped. The footsteps had vanished. The world was silent again. I slid the door open. Cold air surged in, thick and wet like I'd stepped underwater. My flashlight beam was useless, just a pale cone swallowed instantly by the fog. I took 2 steps out, calling softly, "Hello, is someone out there?" Nothing answered. I should have gone back inside, should have locked the door, pulled the blankets over me, and waited for sunrise. But something deep in the fog shifted. A shape, a darker shade of gray, low to the ground, maybe 30 feet away. "Hey, are you hurt?" I whispered. The shape didn't move, didn't breathe. It just hovered in the fog like a shadow suspended in air. I stepped closer, trying to angle the flashlight, and as the beam cut across the shape, I realized it wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything with form. It was more like a void, a patch of fog where light refused to exist. My instincts screamed at me to run. Then the shape vanished. Not drifted, not faded, vanished, like blinking out of existence. The fog around me suddenly deepened, folding in on itself. The air thickened. My legs felt heavy. When I turned to head back to the van, my heart nearly stopped. The Volkswagen was gone. Not just hidden. Gone. The gravel pull-out beneath my boots didn't feel right. The road wasn't where it should have been. My footprints had disappeared behind me. Panic surged through me, icy and immediate. I started walking in the direction I thought the van had been. 10 steps. 20. 30. The fog grew denser with each one until it felt like I was pushing through a physical barrier. The metallic smell was stronger now, sharp enough to sting my throat. I called out again, but even my voice sounded wrong. Flat, swallowed, like the fog didn't want the sound to escape. Then I heard something I'll never forget. A breath, right beside my ear. Slow, wet, human, or close enough to trick the mind into believing so. I stumbled back, slipping on the damp gravel, flashlight clattering out of my hand. The breath came again, this time from behind me, then in front, then circling like the knocking had earlier. I crouched low, heart slamming against my ribs, palms pressed against my ears. The fog pulsed around me, rising and falling like lungs expanding. And then, out of the suffocating white, a faint light flickered. Warm. Familiar. A single golden glow in the distance. My van's interior lamp. Relief crashed over me so hard I almost cried. I scrambled toward the light, slipping, breathing hard, repeating, "There it is. There it is." The fog thinned just enough to let the shape of the Volkswagen emerge, ghost-like, as if it had been moving on its own through the night. When I reached it, the sliding door was open. I knew. I had closed it. I had locked it. Inside, the air felt colder than outside. The blankets were disturbed. My journal lay open on the floor, pages fluttered by a breeze that shouldn't have been there. And on the last page, one I knew I hadn't written on, 5 words were scrawled in a dark, shaky line. "Don't follow the trail." I slammed the door shut, locked every latch, and curled into myself on the bench seat. For the rest of the night, I didn't blink, didn't move, barely breathed. The knocking never returned. The footsteps vanished. But the fog lingered until morning, clinging to the windows like it didn't want to let me go. When the sun finally burned through, everything looked normal, peaceful even. No footprints, no signs of disturbance, no indication anything had happened at all. But when I walked to the edge of the overlook, just beyond where I'd stepped the night before, my stomach dropped, because the ground fell away sharply into a hidden ravine I hadn't seen in the fog. If I'd walked 10 more feet, I would have disappeared into it completely, and there, etched into the soil at the rim, barely visible in the new daylight, a single long trail of something dragged, not walked, toward the edge, and then straight down into the ravine. I left Crater Lake within minutes, but the fog still haunts me. The breath still curls at the edge of my thoughts, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear that patient, rhythmic knocking, like something waiting behind a wall of white, still tracing the van, still circling, still learning me. If there's anything I carried from that night, anything I hope someone else hears in my voice, it's this: trust your unease. Trust the instinct that tightens your chest before your mind can explain why. The wilderness doesn't always want you dead, but it doesn't always care that you live either. And sometimes it watches. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes when the fog rolls in thicker than it should, it comes back looking for the ones who stepped out of the van when they knew they shouldn't have. The first flash of lightning split the sky in half, and in that instant, the world around me shifted. My name is Carter. I'm 32, and I've spent more nights in an RV than in a proper bed. But nothing in my years of camping had prepared me for the way fear can curl into your chest, settle there, and refuse to leave. That evening, I was parked at a small RV site in the Florida Keys, just as the sun began its slow descent into molten orange, painting everything in warm, golden light. At first, the storm seemed distant, an uninvited guest lingering at the horizon. I remember thinking it would pass, as most storms did, and I told myself that the familiar rumble of thunder was just nature's evening show. I was alone. My family had stayed back on the mainland, trusting me to test the waters of this remote campground. Locals had warned me about sudden storms, about how quickly the Keys could turn a bright afternoon into something dark and volatile. But warnings often feel like background noise when you're staring at the horizon and the wind is soft, playful. The air smelled like salt and heat, the tang of the ocean mixing with the damp scent of rain yet to arrive. I went inside my small Volkswagen camper, trying to ignore the low, persistent hum of unease building somewhere in my gut. Then the sky tore open again. This time, the lightning struck closer, almost immediately followed by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the aluminum walls of my RV. I swear, for a heartbeat, it felt as though the strike had landed right on my roof. My heart leapt and slammed against my ribs as I clutched the steering wheel, trembling, though I had nowhere to go. The usual hum of the campground, the soft chatter of distant campers, the occasional bark of a dog, was swallowed by the storm's roar. It was just me, the storm, and the uncanny sense that something beyond nature was watching. I stepped outside, drawn by some reckless need to see it with my own eyes, and the moment I did, the wind slapped me like a living thing. Trees bent and groaned, fronds whipping at each other as if arguing about some unseen offense. Every hair on my body stood on end. I could feel static dancing along my skin, and the smell of ozone stung my nostrils. I wanted to retreat, to shut myself inside the small metal box I called home, but something held me there, an uneasy, irrational curiosity. The RVs around me were empty. I could see through the tinted windows of nearby campers that their interiors were dark, ghostly, abandoned. The campground was alive with shadows that didn't belong, moving in ways that felt deliberate. Another lightning strike, closer than before, illuminated the palm trees in jagged relief. For a split second, I thought I saw figures crouched between them, shadows that moved with too much purpose to be wind-blurred branches. My rational mind screamed that it was nothing. Trees, shadows, trick of the light, but my gut refused to listen. Every instinct in me, every survival reflex I had told me to run, to leave this place, yet I stayed. I wanted evidence, even as the fear clamped down around my chest like a vice. Inside the RV, the storm felt worse, more personal. Each lightning strike made the small vehicle shiver, and the electrical buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead made me think of some unseen circuit straining against the power of nature. My mind played tricks. Whispers in the wind sounded like voices calling my name. The creak of the camper frame seemed deliberate, almost human. The reality was thin, easily shattered. I could not trust what I saw or heard. I tried to calm myself, focusing on the sound of my own breathing, the rhythm of my pulse, telling myself I was alone and safe, but even that was a lie. The fear had found a way inside, and it wasn't leaving. Hours seemed to stretch as the storm raged. Each flash of lightning brought new terror, revealing impossible shapes in the dark. The long, skeletal shadow of a hammock swaying violently as if an invisible hand shook it. The silhouette of a small bird perched on a branch, frozen, staring directly at me, unnervingly still. I wanted to scream, but the sound felt futile against the storm's roar. I wanted to move, but I was trapped inside the RV, trapped inside my own mind. Time lost meaning. The storm became a mirror of my inner state, chaotic, unpredictable, and full of things I could not control. And then it happened. A strike landed just beyond the tree line, the ground shaking beneath me, the smell of scorched earth rising into the camper. The light revealed for a fraction of a second a figure, a man or a shadow of a man, standing motionless at the edge of the woods. My first reaction was denial. There was no one there. It was a trick of lightning, a leftover shadow, a branch. But the unease settled deeper, rooting itself in my chest. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my legs refused. My mind argued with itself in an endless loop, rationality versus fear, denial versus the undeniable. I forced myself to move, creeping to the driver's seat. My hands shook on the wheel. I turned the ignition, hoping to escape, to drive through the storm, but something stopped me. The storm outside felt like a barrier, not of wind and rain, but of will. It pressed against me, whispering through the walls and the spaces between the trees, telling me to stay. I couldn't see it, couldn't understand it, but I felt it, as tangible as the rain running down the camper's metal sides. I had a choice, submit to the fear or confront it. I chose confrontation in the only way I could. I grabbed my flashlight, my knuckles white, and stepped outside again. Rain immediately soaked me, plastering my hair to my forehead, running cold down my neck. I swept the beam over the tree line. The shadows shifted, teasing, and then retreating as if aware of my gaze. Each flash of lightning revealed nothing, yet hinted at everything. The air vibrated with tension, a static charge that seemed alive, breathing in sync with me. I realized then that fear is not only external, it's a predator inside you, waiting for a weakness, a moment of hesitation. Hours passed. The storm slowly lost its fury, retreating back to the horizon, leaving behind a heavy, lingering silence. The campground returned, but it was changed, altered by the violence of the night. The once comforting shapes of RVs, trees, and picnic tables now seemed sinister, coated in the residue of terror. I sat inside my camper, drenched, heart still racing, trying to process what had happened. Did I imagine the figure? Was it only fear playing tricks on a weary mind? Maybe. But I knew the fear was real. The storm had been a teacher, showing me the raw, unfiltered power of nature and the fragility of perception. By dawn, I was awake, the sky painted in soft, forgiving pastels. The storm's remnants shimmered in puddles around the campground. I felt a strange relief mixed with residual dread. I learned then that camping isn't just about enjoying the outdoors. It's about confronting your own vulnerability, about understanding how quickly the ordinary becomes strange and threatening. I packed up my Volkswagen and left that RV park, carrying with me the memory of fear that was at once terrifying and clarifying. Every flash of lightning, every rumble of thunder had reminded me that life can turn in an instant, that safety is fragile, and that courage is not the absence of fear. It is moving forward, even when the world seems to conspire against you. Even now, months later, I can close my eyes and see the storm, the jagged lightning, the shadows dancing at the tree line, the suffocating tension pressing from all sides. And yet, I also feel something stronger, deeper, a respect for the power of nature, for the instincts we too often ignore, and for the quiet resilience we discover when we face the storm, alone, in the dark, with only our own fear as company. I didn't understand what real silence was until the night someone knocked on my RV door out in the Arizona desert. And I don't just mean the quiet you notice when the engine dies and the dust settles. I mean the kind of silence that swallows your own breathing, that makes your heartbeat feel loud enough to give you away, that makes you wonder if you're entirely alone or if something is waiting for you to notice it. My name is Caleb, 38 years old, born and raised in western Kansas, and I'd been driving Route 66 for years, mostly for the freedom, sometimes for the nostalgia. But that summer of 2023, I drove it to forget a few things I wasn't ready to name. I told myself I was looking for scenery, for open space, for a little piece of America untouched by noise and pressure. But the truth was I just wanted to disappear for a while. I thought if I parked far enough from people, my thoughts would quiet down. Instead, the desert gave them room to echo. I'd set up camp at a BLM pull-off, somewhere between Seligman and Kingman, a place with no signs, no bathrooms, just a stretch of earth flattened by the tires of people who didn't want to be found. The sun had gone down in a long, molten scrape across the horizon, and the night cooled fast. My little Volkswagen camper creaked as the heat escaped its panels. The air tasted like dust and old metal. I should have felt at peace. I should have felt isolated in a good way. But I didn't. Even before the knocking, something felt off. The unease started quiet. Small things. The headlights of a car on the distant highway that stayed still too long. A dog barking somewhere far off, then suddenly stopping mid-sound. The hum of the desert insects thinning out as if a wind was coming, even though the air was dead still. These were the kinds of details I usually brushed off as road paranoia. But that night, I kept glancing over my shoulder like someone had said my name. I was cooking a late dinner on my small portable stove, the flame flickering low under a pan of half-burned chili, when I noticed the smell of smoke wasn't drifting out the open window. It was drifting back in, like the air outside was pushing it toward me. I stepped out to check for wind, but the night felt carved from stone. There was no breeze, no movement, just the desert stretching out like a sheet of cold iron under a thin crescent moon. I told myself I was tired, that the road had a way of messing with your senses, that I needed food, sleep, grounding. But a part of me, the part I'd ignored for months, kept whispering that something was wrong, that I hadn't just parked in a quiet patch of desert. I'd parked in a place where quiet meant something else entirely. The first knock came at 1:13 a.m. I wasn't asleep yet. I was lying on my back, staring at the ceiling of my camper, thinking about how the desert made even my memories sound distant. And then a single, sharp, deliberate knock. Not wind, not debris, a knuckle, on metal. My body reacted before my mind processed it. I held my breath, muscles locked, ears straining so hard I could hear my pulse. The knock hadn't been loud, but out there in that dead stillness, it felt like a gunshot. I waited. Nothing. No footsteps. No voice. No crunch of gravel under someone moving away. Just the aftershock of adrenaline pulsing through my arms. I whispered to myself that maybe something fell or an animal brushed against the door. I even tried to laugh under my breath, but the sound came out thin, cracked. I forced myself to sit up, forced my shaking hands to rest on my knees, forced the fear down with the same stubbornness I'd used to ignore every warning sign in my personal life. The second knock came softer, almost testing. I froze again, but this time my fear had a shape. It wasn't the panic of being startled, it was suspicion. The sense that someone out there knew I was awake, knew I was listening, knew exactly how far they could push before I made a sound. I reached slowly toward my window, but I didn't pull the curtain aside. Not yet. I listened. But there was nothing. Not even insects now. The whole desert had gone still, like everything living had taken a breath at the same time and held it. At that moment, I felt something I couldn't name. It wasn't just fear. It was the dread that comes when you realize you aren't imagining things, when your instincts, those same instincts you've buried under years of rational thinking, start screaming that something is wrong, and that if you act like nothing is happening, you're exactly the prey someone hopes you'll be. Just when I gathered the courage to look outside, the air changed. I didn't hear anyone walking, but I sensed movement near the rear of my RV, like someone sliding quietly along the side panel. My breath stuttered. My hands trembled against the curtain. I didn't move it, because part of me was suddenly terrified of seeing a face staring back. The steps, if they were steps, were impossibly slow. There was no gravel crunch, no scuff, no breath, just a faint pressure, like someone's weight disturbed the ground enough for my instincts to register it. Then came a third knock, this one on the back hatch. 3 knocks now, from 2 different sides of the RV, with no footsteps crossing between them. That detail didn't hit me until later. At the time, my brain did that thing brains do when terror outruns logic. It tried to create explanations that made no sense, but felt safer than the truth. Maybe someone snuck around quietly. Maybe the desert swallowed sound differently. Maybe I was imagining things. Denial is a comforting liar. I whispered, "Who's there?" But the silence after my words felt like a trap, as if the desert itself held its breath, waiting for a response it already knew wouldn't come. When I finally dared to pull the curtain back just an inch, the window was a black mirror reflecting my own terrified face. No shapes, no movement, just the sense that the darkness outside was heavier than it should have been, like it pressed against the glass. I thought about turning on the exterior light, but something deep inside me said, "Don't," because whatever was out there hadn't shown itself yet, and if I exposed it, I wouldn't be able to unsee what was watching me. Then something touched the window. Not a knock, not a hit, just the faintest drag of fingers along the glass. Soft, slow, intentional. My chest tightened so hard I thought I'd pass out. That sound, the whisper of skin against glass, felt wrong in a way I still can't describe. It wasn't the action itself. It was the calmness of it. Like someone was letting me know they didn't need to rush, like they had time, like they were enjoying this. My rational mind shattered. All the skepticism, the logical explanations, the stubborn disbelief, it collapsed under the weight of a simple truth. Someone was messing with me, and they weren't afraid. They weren't uncertain. They weren't even hiding their presence. I killed the interior lights. Not for stealth, my breathing was loud enough to give me away, but because I needed the illusion of control, even if it was paper thin. When the 4th knock came, this time at the front door again, it wasn't a knock at all. It was a whisper of impact, so soft you'd miss it if you weren't tuned into terror, like a radio frequency. It felt like fingertips resting against the metal, then sliding down. I wanted to run, to start the engine, peel out across the desert, or up anything to get away from whatever was outside. But fear pinned me. I'd heard stories my whole life of RV break-ins, road drifters, desert wanderers who tested locks until they found someone asleep. But this wasn't that. This wasn't someone trying to get in. This was someone letting me know they already could. My breath turned shallow. I pictured myself sprinting to the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys, headlights cutting through the night. And then what? Running over someone, getting stuck in the wash, driving blind into cactus fields. I felt trapped inside my own logic. Then something happened that nearly broke me. A voice spoke. Not loud, not aggressive, just a whisper right against the door seam, too soft to be real, too close. It said my name. But here's the part that made my stomach twist into something cold and unfamiliar. It wasn't my name in a stranger's voice. It was my name in my mother's voice. My mother, who lived 3 states away. My mother, whose voice I hadn't heard in weeks. My mother, who would never be wandering alone in the Arizona desert at 1:30 in the morning. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. The voice didn't repeat. Just that one word, Caleb, sliding through the metal like breath through a crack. I don't remember making the choice to start the engine. One moment I was frozen, the next my hand was twisting the key with a desperation so fierce it hurt my wrist. The engine roared louder than it ever had. The headlights burst across the desert floor, and nothing was there. No footsteps, no tire tracks, no shadows, just endless flat sand stretching into the dark. I threw the van into gear and tore out of that campsite so fast I nearly ripped my awning off. I didn't slow down for miles. I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't breathe until I saw the faint glow of Kingman in the distance. And here's the part that stays with me. The part I don't talk about when people ask why I don't boondock alone anymore. When I finally pulled into a gas station lot, trembling, exhausted, half delirious, I stepped out to splash water on my face. And on the passenger side window, perfectly centered, was a long, slow fingerprint drag mark. 4 streaks. one curve where it traced the glass downward. I'd cleaned that window before leaving camp. I know I had. I remember wiping it twice, and when I pressed my hand up next to the streaks, they were longer than mine. I still don't know if someone followed me that night. I don't know if whoever or whatever whispered my name did it out of malice or something else. But I do know this. When the desert goes quiet in a way that makes your instincts rise, listen. When something knocks in the dead of night, don't tell yourself it's nothing. And if a voice outside your RV sounds like someone you love, lock your doors, kill the lights, and leave. Because the desert knows your name long before you know what's out there whispering it back to you. I never thought the quiet of the Smoky Mountains could feel so loud. My name is Ethan, I'm 32, and I've spent years chasing empty roads and abandoned campgrounds in my old Volkswagen camper, believing the solitude would somehow calm the chaos in my head. But that November, in 2024, the mountains had a different idea. The air was crisp, almost brittle, carrying the sharp scent of wet leaves and something else, something I couldn't place at first, like the faint trace of smoke from a fire that had long since died. I had parked my camper near a trailhead deep in the forest, away from the scattered clusters of weekend travelers who'd already packed up and left, leaving me alone with shadows that felt as if they had been waiting for me. The first night, the quiet was deceiving. I thought it would be peaceful, the kind of silence you can only find when the world has shrugged you off. But there was an unease in that quiet. Every crack of a branch underfoot sounded deliberate. The rustling of leaves felt like whispers just beyond my vision. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. I leaned back in my chair, the VW's heater humming a low, nervous rhythm, and sipped a cup of coffee that had gone cold too fast. My rational mind kept repeating the same mantra: you're alone, you're safe, this is just the forest. Then I saw it, or at least I thought I did. A shadow moving between the trees, just at the edge of the clearing where I had parked. My heart jumped, my throat tightened. I told myself it was a deer, or a trick of the moonlight. But the movement was deliberate. The way it lingered, the way it seemed to watch me. I felt exposed, like the forest itself had turned into an audience, silent and patient, waiting for me to notice. I closed my eyes, trying to calm the tightening in my chest, but when I opened them again, the shadow was still there, farther back, yet unmistakably deliberate. The night pressed in. Every sound was amplified, the distant cry of a fox, the snap of a branch, the soft scrape of leaves. I began to notice patterns in the noises, subtle at first, almost musical, like footsteps circling, pausing, circling again. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was aware of my every move. I told myself to sleep, to let the exhaustion carry me into ignorance. But my body refused. My eyes darted from the camper window to the dark woods. I could see shapes now, not just shadows, tall, thin silhouettes that seemed to vanish whenever I blinked. By the third night, my mind was unraveling. I started leaving little markers around my sight, sticks in a line, stones in patterns, as if mapping an invisible perimeter would give me some control. It didn't help. The forest had a rhythm of its own, and I was painfully out of step. Every time I stepped outside to check my perimeter, I felt eyes on me. Sometimes it was just the movement of the trees, but sometimes, when the wind died down, the feeling was undeniable, piercing, a deliberate scrutiny that made my skin crawl. One evening, I had been cooking inside the camper when I heard it, a knock on the side door. Slow, deliberate. My breath froze in my lungs. I live alone, miles from the nearest ranger station. I told myself it must be a branch falling against the door or a raccoon testing its luck. But the sound came again, 3 knocks evenly spaced as if someone or something was counting me. My rational mind screamed at me to ignore it, to stay calm, but my body betrayed me, trembling as I crept to the window. Nothing, just the black expanse of the forest. And yet, deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. Sleep became impossible. My dreams were invaded by that forest. Shadows with 2 long limbs, whispers that spoke my name. eyes reflecting moonlight, too high, too close, watching, always watching. I began to question my own senses. Was I seeing shapes where there were none? Were my ears playing tricks? But even when my mind doubted, my body never forgot the feeling. Cold dread creeping up my spine, the unmistakable awareness of being hunted. Not for food, not for survival, but for the terror itself. One night, I decided to leave, to drive back down the mountain to somewhere, anywhere, that had lights and life. As I slid into the driver's seat, I noticed something I hadn't before, impressions in the dirt around the camper. Footprints, too tall to be human, leading into the trees in a path that circled back toward me. Panic gripped me fully then, a rising tide that made my hands shake and my chest ache. I started the engine, and that's when I heard it. A low, deliberate sound, a whispering groan that seemed almost articulate. I slammed the doors, locked myself in, and kept my eyes on the rearview mirror. There, between the trees, I glimpsed the figures, tall, thin, impossibly still, watching, waiting. Driving down the narrow, winding road, I kept my headlights focused on the bends, my mind replaying every moment, every sound. I realized then that my fear was more than instinct. It was a message, a warning encoded in the silence and the shadows. The Smoky Mountains had not only tested me, but had forced me to confront my own vulnerability, my reliance on reason in a place that refused to obey it. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, the fog of fear clinging to me like a second skin, I pulled over and breathed for what felt like hours. The VW was silent, the road empty, and yet I could still feel it, the awareness that I had been observed, studied, weighed. I learned that night that some forests carry more than wildlife. They carry the weight of perception, the echo of being alone where the world is not meant to watch, but to haunt. Since that November, I've returned to campgrounds, always in the daylight, always near others. But the shadow of that forest, the slow crawl of fear that doesn't announce itself with screams but with the faintest movements, has never left me. I think about it often, about how easily the mind bends under tension, how isolation sharpens instinct but can also betray it. And though I drive past those same roads, pass by the familiar curves, I never forget the lesson. Solitude in nature is seductive, but the forest will always hold its secrets, and sometimes those secrets are watching you. I tried to convince myself that reaching the edge of the forest was enough, that the danger had stayed behind, cloaked in shadow and silence. But as I drove, a creeping sense of being followed grew. Every mirror reflection seemed elongated, stretched unnaturally. Every passing tree became a possible watcher. My eyes strained to see beyond the road, and I felt the weight of something unblinking pressing against my back. The VW hummed over the asphalt, engine vibrating, tires gripping the cold November road, but the fear inside me vibrated louder than any machine ever could. I pulled over at a small turnout, my hands slick with sweat, and stepped outside. The wind cut through my jacket, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay, the kind that is neither fully alive nor dead that lingers between seasons. I told myself to breathe, to remind myself I was safe, but the moment I exhaled, I felt it, the sensation of being surrounded. From the corner of my eye, dark shapes seemed to flare and vanish among the trees, just beyond the fog drifting over the mountainside. My rational brain screamed, it's fog, it's shadows, it's exhaustion. But my instincts, owned from years alone on the road, screamed louder. You are being watched. I climbed back into the camper, heart hammering, and tried to make sense of what I had seen or not seen. That's when I realized the forest had found a way inside me. Every creak of the VW, every gust of wind brushing across the metal, sounded like footsteps following me, circling me, closing in. I felt my mind fraying, a slow tearing, as I replayed every movement, every sound, trying to untangle reality from the forest's trickery. Sleep was impossible. I tried to rest at a small motel further down the mountain, but every rustle outside my window, every shadow cast by the flickering streetlight triggered memories of the forest, the watching, the waiting, the slow, deliberate presence that didn't belong to any living being I had ever known. I knew then that the fear wasn't just about what was outside, but about how easily it had wormed inside me. The forest had taught me its lesson in patience, in observation, in the subtle terror of the unseen. Weeks later, I returned to the mountains, this time with companions, during daylight, surrounded by laughter and firelight. And yet, even then, I caught glimpses of that November fear. A tree branch would snap unexpectedly, a fog bank would curl unnaturally around a bend, and my stomach would tighten, memories of those silent watchers flashing in my mind. The fear had become part of me, an awareness that solitude can be seductive, but also dangerously deceptive. I've realized that camping alone isn't inherently dangerous, but ignoring your instincts, dismissing the small warnings, believing you are in control, that is dangerous. The forest doesn't need to strike, it simply exists, and that existence can unravel a mind unprepared for its quiet cunning. That November, I learned to respect more than just the wilderness. I learned to respect my own perception, my instincts, and the fragile line between courage and foolishness. Driving through the Smoky Mountains now, I am changed. I notice the subtle sounds, the rustle of leaves that may be nothing or may be something. I carry with me the understanding that being alone doesn't mean being safe. And though I continue to seek the roads less traveled, the campgrounds empty at night, I do so with a deeper vigilance, with a slower, more careful awareness. I know now that the forest is patient and it watches, quietly, deliberately, waiting for the moment you forget it is there. The VW sits in my driveway now, polished but weathered, a silent witness to that November. And sometimes when the night is still and the wind carries just right, I swear I can feel that presence again, a subtle pressure in my chest, a whisper at the edge of thought. It reminds me that fear is not just an instinct. It is a lesson, etched into the bones of the mountains, into the rhythm of the forest, into the mind of anyone who dares to wander alone. And as much as it haunts me, as much as it lingers in the corners of my memory, I cannot deny the truth it taught me. Solitude carries beauty, but also vigilance. Curiosity brings wonder, but also caution. And the forest, in all its shadowed glory, will always have eyes for those who step too deeply into its embrace. And that's the lesson I carry. The quiet, relentless reminder that the forest doesn't just test your courage, it tests your mind, your awareness, your very perception of reality. I am no longer the same traveler I was that November, but in that change I have found a clarity born from fear. The ability to see the world, even in its shadows, with both respect and understanding, with caution and awe, with awareness that even the most silent places are never truly empty, and that sometimes the scariest encounters are not with creatures, but with the truths they force you to face inside yourself.